The final part of the Cat's Cradle trilogy, the second series of Doctor Who's Virgin New Adventures, reached an end. Would this tie together threads from the previous two disparate and seemingly unlinked stories, or would it be about as satisfying a closure to an arc as the Reality War? I think we all know the answer to that. Welcome back to the Library of St John the Beheaded, a history of Doctor Who in prose, and this episode we're looking at Cat's Cradle Witchmark by Andrew Hunt. Andrew Hunt was a teenage Doctor Who fan when he heard about the launch of the Virgin New Adventures and sent in a prospective story to Peter Darvill Evans. This would become Cat's Cradle Witchmark. Giving the task of tying up a series of books to a newcomer once more, Darvill Evans must have had some confidence in Hunt, although that's the only thing this and Time Worm Revelation have in common. There's not much behind-the-scenes trivia about the book, although without slightly dodgily drawn human characters, the cover ends up being one of the best in the New Adventures. After the mix of ancient Gallifreyan legend and surreal horror of Time's Crucible and the bleak dystopian cyberpunk of Warhead, Witchmark finds the books following the TV series formula by heading off into different territory once again, this time with a story that is basically pure fantasy of the Tolkien variety. It's Doctor Who's first real foray into the area, certainly to this degree, which makes it unique if nothing else, but is it any good? It certainly doesn't hold back on its themes. The prologue begins with a character called Bathsheba musing on the fortress Dinorban and the council of Tuatha de Danann, 2 days' ride away in the kingdom of Tir na Og, and the Fomor, the god Giobni, and the power of Iran, Drufford the troll, and various other gits. I hate this kind of stuff. To be honest, I generally find fantasy impenetrable, and this is one of the reasons. Rarely are we afforded an outsider's view of the world, instead plunged deep into lore of places with ludicrous names and no explanations. It's an alienating experience. Occasionally I'll find a writer with suitable skill to be able to navigate this kind of thing well. Tolkien, George R.R. Martin, Robert Jordan on a particularly good day. But otherwise it's something I just struggle with immensely. I remember reading my first Lovecraft anthology and really enjoying it until I got to the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, which took me longer to read than the rest of the book combined. Anyway, in short, this doesn't set the book off to a good start for me. Still, we get reference to the title pretty quickly, with Bathsheba being born with stunted growth in one of her arms and everyone assuming she was a witch. She has her hair shorn short to enable villagers to check if the mark of the witch appears on her neck. The assumption then is that this is a primitive planet. The Doctor and Ace will land and save Bathsheba from the witch hunters while getting to the root of a strange mark, right? Wrong, actually. If there's one thing you can say about Witchmark is that it has some surprising twists. At first, anyway. As Bathsheba's father reads from a book, described as being from the other world, he quotes the book of Matthew from the Bible, and then Bathsheba goes and talks to a unicorn who prophesies terrible things in the near future. And then we're suddenly thrust into Time Lord lore. Not even accurate Time Lord lore. It was Omega who created the Eye of Harmony, not Rassilon. Maybe someone should have reminded Russell T Davies of this as well. There's a quick reference to telepathically powered timescapes from Time's Crucible, and then we discover that this is all a preamble for the fact that the Doctor's TARDIS is in a bad way. Losing its link to the Eye of Harmony and in a general state of disrepair, it struggles to hang in the time vortex. This suddenly feels like it's going to tie up the Cat's Cradle trilogy quite neatly with a weird diversion in the middle. No such luck, but it does at least use the setup of Time's Crucible to introduce the story here, forcing the ship to land to take repairs. And that's just the prologue. The first chapter starts as one of those stories that contrast two different things. We get a character pursued by killers in a fantasy world, and policemen investigating a coach crash in Wales. The Welsh story actually feels like a proper Who-ish setup. The coach had 42 unidentified passengers, each of them with a suitcase containing tens of thousands of pounds, each of them dressed in brand new Marks and Spencer's clothing, all with the witch mark on their necks. Meanwhile, a vet is called to help a foaling. He notices the mother horse has a cut on her head right in the place a unicorn's horn, much like the one he recently found might be. It's exactly the kind of thing I can imagine UNIT investigating. With the usual coincidence, the TARDIS arrives just down the road in the village of Llanfair Ceiriog. Clearly a spot he's been to before, as he's greeted by an old friend, local drunk old Davy, who thinks nothing of the time and space ship appearing out of thin air. Apparently last time he was here it was with Mel. A recent Easter egg for you. The pub in the 2024 episode, 73 Yards, sells Llanfair Ceiriog Pale Ale on cask. Given that episode's fairy ring has a magical fantasy leaning, it's a very fitting reference. The Llanfair parts of the book are pretty atmospheric, a portrait of a grey, damp but picturesque part of North Wales, populated by the usual suspects. Policemen, a vet, hikers, eccentric locals. Again, it brings to mind 70s Who, particularly the UNIT era, and later stories like Stones of Blood and 80s tales like The Awakening and Curse of Fenric. Who has always done folk horror adjacent stories pretty well, and the atmosphere here is another great example. In contrast, the world of Tir na Og is populated by very familiar fantasy figures. Trolls, unicorns, centaurs, fox-like creatures that are sort of hobbits but not, people with bows and arrows. They all have their own names here: Fomwa, Kefil, Furbolg, Siddi. As a result, the world feels less inviting. Although the final reveal is a long way off when starting the book, it's not easy to feel invested in something that feels fictional already. Whereas later Missing Adventure, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, manages this by highlighting the strangeness and general unlikeliness and uncanny feeling of a world inhabited by mythological creatures, here we're invited to care about the world and its inhabitants, and it's just not that easy. The split between the two sections isn't quite the expected one. After the prologue and the opening couple of pages of Chapter 1, it would be easy to expect the story to flip between the two for the whole book. Instead, there's a lot of time spent in Wales at the start. Adding to the weirdness, two American teens on a walking holiday stumble across an injured centaur and seem weirdly nonplussed by it. Inspector Stevens of New Scotland Yard turns up to investigate Stuart Taylor's unicorn sighting. The Doctor and Ace investigate some ruins and an ancient stone circle. Unfortunately, Ace walks through the gap between stone circles and somehow transports both her and the Doctor to Tir na Og, the name of a Celtic afterlife, by the way. And that's where the action largely shifts to the fantasy world. And yes, not only is the setting based on fantasy cliches, but the story is too. Our heroes must go on a quest to save the world. They'll travel across the broad lands of Tir na Og, unite warring factions and stop the evil god from releasing the demons that have been terrorising the land and destroying the world. As with all quest stories, there's very little in the way of structure other than just a series of encounters. Halfway through the book, we finally catch up with Batsiba when the Doctor and Ace stumble across her as the lone survivor of an attack on her family home. I suppose there is a novelty to the idea of Doctor Who doing a full-on, no-holds-barred fantasy story. It's certainly different, but at the same time it's just so unoriginal. I'm not a big fan of taking on other genres and stories. The homages in the Hinchcliffe and Holmes era do little for me, but at least they were put together by writers at the top of their game, and they always incorporated classic literary themes into a Who-ish sci-fi story. Witchmark isn't a Doctor Who take on fantasy, it's Doctor Who in a fantasy story, written by a first-time writer. And Hunt wears his influences on his sleeve. Some chapters are named after Lord of the Rings chapters, while old Davy's favourite books are also Tolkien. The split in the story is massive. Whenever the action shifts back to Wales, the Americans investigating where the centaur came from, for example, I'm reading with joy, and when we're in Tolkien land, my eyes are slipping off the page and skimming over paragraphs. Most of the bigger surprises come from Llanfair Ceiriog too, such as the Doctor and Ace suddenly turning up at their guest house, wrapped in rags, despite being concurrently in a castle on the other side of the gateway. David, one of the Americans, is kidnapped in the middle of the night and taken to be burned as a witch due to having the witch mark on his neck. The quest is at least punctuated by moments of robotic instructions, which hint that there's something more and maybe a bit more science fiction-y going on here. Thermal identified at 1 to 1 to 0 to 100. Alter heading to accommodate. Rise 1000. Awaiting instructions, and so on. These happen every few pages when we're on the fantasy side. It won't be much of a surprise to hear that the Doctor and Ace get separated. The Time Lord, accompanied by Batsiba, heads on to Giobni and meets Stuart Taylor the vet on his journey. Ace joins with a herd of unicorns, bonding with one called Bat, enabling them to communicate, and travels back to the gateway. The final act is ushered in with a couple of moments that push the story towards its climax. Ace and a herd of unicorns race through the gateway and meet the investigators, just as the owner of the crashed coach is on the verge of covering up the mysterious goings-on for good. And the Doctor and Stuart discover the identity of the robotic commands we've been reading for the past few chapters, the electronic brain of a giant biomechanical dragon, which is responsible for burning swathes of Tir Nan Og. After a slow and lengthy second act, things are finally beginning to come together. And then the resolution is, well, surprisingly simple. For once, the Doctor's idea of just talking to the villain actually works. Giobni is a scientist, and the planet is inhabited by his experiments, taken from myths told by the species he initially took as a blueprint, humanity. As his experiment into ecosystems is over, he's turned off the power source and ignored the genetic failures escaping from his pens. The Doctor suggests turning the sun back on and returning to the experiment in many generations' time. Giobni agrees this would make for interesting observations, and sends his dragons to track down the escaped rejects and kill them. The return of the sun brings about peace between the warring races, and the plan to escape to Earth. The coach, for those who haven't worked it out, was full of escapee humans from Tir Nan Og, is abandoned. It's even revealed that the witch mark is branding added during artificial breeding, making the witches escaped mutations, spoiled by demonic protoplasm apparently, somewhat absolving the witch burners in the process. These are indeed demonic mutants. Honestly, this all feels a bit too easy. Even when spanners are thrown in the works, a demon among the people, Giobni willing to let everyone die, David coincidentally turning out to be a demon himself, it all coalesces into a fairly run-of-the-mill battle, a mass of demonic hordes marching on a heavily armoured fortress in true Lord of the Rings style. The very end is odd. Our heroes all make it back to Earth in one piece before the stone circle is destroyed. The unicorns, including Ace's friend Bat, are directed to UNIT with the promise that the brig will look after them. Because, of course, I'm sure the Brigadier really knows where to put a large flock of unicorns. But then there's Hugh and Janet, the couple running the inn the Doctor and Ace stayed in, killed and replaced by the shapeshifters who disguised themselves as the TARDIS crew. The assumption is that these were two demons, but on the whole this seems to serve absolutely no narrative purpose whatsoever, and their deaths feel pointless. The TARDIS is cured by Hearn, a previously pointless character created by Giobni, merging with his double, Old Davy, the drunk with the Tolkien obsession, to create a rock of protoplasm, which the Silver Cat, remember that, somehow uses to heal the TARDIS. A single speck of protoplasm is given more attention and described very slightly ominously, but the Doctor doesn't notice it. It feels rushed, tacked on, the tying up of loose ends not created by this story, but leaving other new ones open and unexplained. It is ultimately a very unsatisfying ending. There's a strange relationship to continuity in the book. A paragraph explaining that the Doctor can regenerate is followed a page later by casual reference to block transfer computation. The plot of Time's Crucible is summed up neatly but incomprehensibly to anyone who hasn't read it, or frankly anyone who has. We get a summary of the plot of Legopolis, followed by references to Axos and the Nestine. There's still this nagging feeling that the Virgin team don't quite know who these books are for. Newcomers, children, adult Doctor Who nerds, all of the above. Truth is, this is somewhat on the head of Peter Darvill Evans, who in his role as editor should have pushed for more tonal consistency. The full list of TV stories referenced is lengthy, from An Unearthly Child to Survival. Hunt is a competent writer, but nothing more. He writes in detail, tries to flesh out his world and his characters so they feel satisfying and worth investing time in, but he also trades in cliches. The butterfly flaps its wings and causes the weather to change, signifying how everything is linked. It's a tired old cliche and was back in the 90s. And frankly, the characterisation isn't all that deep. Inspector Anderson is happy to be working because it gets him away from his wife. An old Welsh couple comment on the rainy weather being unusual for the summer. Has Hunt been to Wales? The two Americans on a backpacking tour of Europe are irritating jerks. David, much more than Jack admittedly, but halfway through switched to bland anonymous anybodies. Stuart Taylor, the vet, I can only picture as Peter Davison's Tristram Farnan in All Creatures Great and Small for some reason. On the other hand, Inspector Stevens is a prototype Fox Mulder, a New Scotland Yard employee but treated with little respect by his co-workers due to him being the sole member of the Paranormal Investigations team with its focus on the strange and the paranormal, his office adorned with photos of UFOs and investigations into cryptids. The X-Files parallels are eerie, especially given the book was published at the same time Chris Carter was shipping the pilot around to networks in the US. There can't have been any intentional influence here. There's also a very strange moment at the start of Chapter 3. He propped open the book on the steering wheel, tore off a page corner to chew, and made another effort to read it. Maybe it's just me, and I've led a sheltered life, but is this a common thing? Do people eat corners of the pages of their books? Occasionally the writing just feels a bit redundant. A rose by any other name, commented the doctor. What's that? Asked Reese. Shakespeare, the doctor told him, but the captain's face remained blank. English literature would naturally be a mystery to him. The final sentence there is surely self-explanatory. Again, some tighter editing would really improve the book. Weirdly, Arthur, the surly pub landlord, has more personality and backstory than anyone else in the book. If Hunt was older, I'd have guessed the character was based on experience. Ace's music taste has shifted again. This time she's enthusiastic about 50s rock and roll, including Cliff Richard. She still has a certain youthful innocence about her, shocked at some of the grotesque things she sees. At the centre of the camp lay the bodies of two pregnant women. Their bellies had been slit open and the babies plucked out and then strangled with their own umbilical cords. Ace's response is to throw up and then cry. She isn't on the receiving end of any leching this time, thankfully, other than clearly gaining the attention of the American lads, although the idea of her exclaiming, "You're police, Brill," feels enormously out of character and is especially jarring after the previous novel's anarchic overtones. The Doctor is, other than planning to go back and leave a note telling Hugh and Janet he's coming, not his usual scheming self here. There's the usual touch of aloofness, the lack of charisma that makes earlier Doctors so different from the seventh, but otherwise he's generally more like the easy-going parts of his TV self than the version being slowly developed over the course of the books so far. Witchmark is a frustrating book, one that feels like the work of a young, inexperienced author and a very lenient editor. There's a very obvious reason for that, of course, which isn't to say it's not worth reading. Indeed, it's the amount of good ideas here that make it so frustrating. The bulk of the chapters set in Wales are very strong, a classic Who mystery with some likeable characters and surprises around every corner. The fantasy stuff, however, will have much more limited appeal. While the final reveal that it's all inspired by the mind of a Tolkien fan makes sense of the unoriginality of the setting, that, and the similarly unoriginal quest plot, don't make for any less tedious reading if you're not an enormous fantasy fan. It's the most common criticism I see of the book, and one I fully agree with. There's also the issue of weird loose ends, bizarre continuity references. Why throw in remarks about nearly 20 past stories if you're also going to include a lengthy paragraph explaining who UNIT are? And some generally odd moments, such as the first scene of Chapter 1, which I still cannot actually connect up to any other part of the plot. Witchmark isn't a bad book, but it's also frustratingly not a great one either. That said, it's also an important part of the VNAs, setting up 2 future plots and wrapping up a trilogy. Speaking of which, let's look at Cat's Cradle as a whole. Unlike Time Worm, which at least had a recurring villain, albeit one largely absent from the middle 2 books, Cat's Cradle's through line is much more abstract. The silver cat seen in all 3 books is named Lynx and is a block transfer computation model of the TARDIS's survival circuits, which explains why it appears during the cataclysm at the start of Time's Crucible, sticks around in Warhead and disappears after it's fixed the link to the Eye of Harmony and Witchmark. Okay, so we never get a proper explanation of exactly what the process was, where it came from, or what its ultimate plan was, and the solution at the end of Witchmark is similarly baffling and vague, and this makes it all seem a little convoluted and unnecessary. Such is the issue with an editor imposing an arc but then leaving it up to the authors, who've never spoken to each other, to work out how to implement it. I, of course, leave out Warhead there, as it's obvious Andrew Cartmel wanted absolutely nothing to do with the arc at all, not even featuring the TARDIS in his book, and writing in the caps somewhat begrudgingly. In Bookwyrm, Volume 1, Anthony Wilson and Stacey Smith described the series as being about magic versus science, which holds some truth for the first book and less so the third, but I don't think it was intentional. It's clear from how tacked on the Cat's Cradle stuff is in Witchmark that the story existed long before the arc came along. By the time Peter Darvill-Evans began commissioning books to follow Cat's Cradle, it had become obvious from Time Worm's sales and feedback that the arcs weren't especially popular, which was clearly wise thinking. This would be the last time the books would adopt series names in their titles, and the next arc wouldn't be for another 18 months, by which point the range will be more developed, with a team of writers in regular communication with each other. As always, I'll close with some favourite quotes. At the sight of the large armchair by the fire, Ace rushed forward and threw herself down. "Brilliant," she said, extending her legs so that her feet were just inches from the grate. She immediately kicked off her trainers and wiggled her toes in the heat. "Excuse me, Hugh," the doctor said. "She's from Perivale." Hugh nodded, as if this explained everything. The diffuse grey sunlight of the Welsh summer had gone, replaced by a hellish glow emanating from the baleful red orb that hung malignantly in the dark, crimson-streaked sky. In the dim illumination, it seemed to her that the contours of the valley were unchanged, but the trees which had filled it had squatted lower and sprouted canvas overhangs. Next time, it's the arrival of a name that will be familiar to a lot of Doctor Who fans, Mark Gatiss, with his debut novel, Nightshade. In the meantime, do leave me a comment down below. I'd love to know what you thought of this video and this book. There's also like, subscribe and share buttons you might like to press as well, and I really hope you'll join me next time.